Carl Jung identified four basic functions that every human mind uses to process reality: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, and he observed something genuinely important about how these four functions actually develop across a real human life. No person develops all four equally. Every individual naturally favors one function above the others, relying on it so consistently and so successfully that it becomes highly refined, almost like a well-trained specialist skill, while the function standing directly opposite to this favored one on Jung's model receives far less conscious attention and remains comparatively primitive, undeveloped, and childish throughout most of a person's adult life. Jung called this neglected, underdeveloped function the inferior function, and he came to believe that understanding your own particular inferior function was one of the single most important keys to understanding your own worst, most embarrassing, and most self-defeating moments. The person whose dominant function is thinking, who processes the world primarily through logical analysis, careful reasoning, and objective evaluation, tends to have feeling as their inferior function, meaning their capacity for warm, spontaneous emotional expression and their ability to accurately gauge the emotional atmosphere of a situation remains comparatively undeveloped and unreliable. The person whose dominant function is feeling, who naturally evaluates the world through personal values and emotional resonance, tends to have thinking as their inferior function, meaning their capacity for cold, objective, dispassionate, logical analysis remains comparatively crude and unreliable. A similar opposition exists between sensation and intuition. The person grounded primarily in concrete, immediate physical reality tending to have underdeveloped access to abstract, future-oriented, intuitive perception, and the reverse holding true for the naturally intuitive person. What makes this pattern so important to understand, according to Jung, is not simply that the inferior function is weaker or less skilled than the dominant one. It is that the inferior function, precisely because it has been so consistently neglected and pushed to the margins of conscious development, tends to behave in a strikingly different and far more troublesome way than the well-developed dominant function ever does. Where the dominant function operates with conscious control, nuance, and flexibility, the inferior function tends to erupt suddenly and involuntarily, arriving not as a calm and considered contribution, but as an overwhelming flood that the person has very little conscious ability to moderate or direct. This is precisely why so many people's most embarrassing, most regretted moments involve exactly this kind of sudden and uncontrolled eruption of their weakest, least developed capacity. Consider the highly capable, thinking dominant professional, someone whose sharp, logical, analytical mind serves them brilliantly in ordinary circumstances, who suddenly finds themselves overwhelmed by an intense, disproportionate, almost childish flood of raw emotion during some unexpected personal crisis, weeping uncontrollably or exploding in a burst of frustration that feels, even to themselves, wildly out of character and impossible to properly manage or express with any of their usual composure. This is not, according to Jung's understanding, some random and inexplicable malfunction. It is the predictable eruption of an inferior feeling function, so undeveloped and so unpracticed that when circumstances finally force it into activity, it behaves with all the crude, unmoderated intensity of a much younger and far less mature version of the person, precisely because it has never been given the years of conscious practice and refinement that their dominant thinking function received. The reverse pattern shows up just as consistently in naturally warm, feeling-dominant people whose rich emotional attunement and genuine care for others serves them beautifully in most circumstances, but who occasionally produce a piece of reasoning or a stated opinion so crude, so rigid, and so surprisingly unsophisticated that it startles everyone around them, including themselves, precisely because their underdeveloped thinking function, when it does finally activate, lacks all the nuance and flexibility that it dares of conscious practice would have given it if undeeped. Jung believed that understanding this pattern offered real and practical value because it explained a kind of self-defeating behavior that most people experience as simply confusing and shameful, without ever understanding its actual underlying structure. If you know that your own inferior function tends to erupt in crude, uncontrolled, embarrassing ways precisely during moments of stress, fatigue, or crisis when your usual dominant function is too exhausted or overwhelmed to maintain its normal control, you can begin to recognize these eruptions for what they actually are rather than simply concluding in the aftermath that you are somehow fundamentally broken or out of control. The thinking dominant person's sudden emotional flooding is not proof that they are secretly an unstable person. It is the predictable activation of a genuinely undeveloped function finally being forced into use. This understanding also points towards something genuinely important about long-term psychological growth. Jung believed that a person could not simply ignore their inferior function forever, hoping it would remain permanently dormant and cause no further trouble. The old writer Schiller, whose work Jung studied closely on exactly this subject, observed that a neglected function does not disappear simply because it has been repressed and undervalued. It continues to exist, continues to demand eventual expression, and the conscious refusal to ever develop or acknowledge it tends only to guarantee that when it does eventually erupt, it will do so with maximum crudeness and maximum disruption precisely because it has never been given any opportunity to mature. The genuine path forward, according to this understanding, was neither to remain permanently identified with only the dominant function, treating the inferior function as a shameful weakness to be hidden and denied forever, nor to attempt some sudden and forced takeover in which the inferior function was pushed to instantly match the sophistication of the long-developed dominant one. Both of these approaches, Jung and Schiller agreed, tended to produce genuine psychological conflict rather than genuine growth. The wiser path involved a slow, patient, and consciously undertaken process of gradually developing at least some capacity in the neglected inferior function, not to make it equal to the dominant function, which was rarely fully achievable, but simply to give it enough conscious development that its inevitable eventual activation would no longer arrive as a crude and overwhelming eruption, but as a more moderate and manageable contribution. This offers a genuinely useful practical exercise for understanding your own recurring pattern of embarrassing or self-defeating moments. Think back on the times in your own life when you have behaved in a way that felt genuinely out of character, crude, overwhelming, or difficult to control, especially during periods of real stress or exhaustion, when your usual composed and capable self was not fully available. Consider whether this behavior consistently clusters around a particular capacity, whether it is always emotional flooding, or always rigid and crude judgment, or always an inability to handle abstract possibility, or always a startling disconnection from immediate practical reality. This consistent pattern is very likely pointing directly at your own particular inferior function, the quietly neglected capacity that has been waiting, largely unattended, for the kind of patient, conscious development that alone would allow it to mature. If you can identify a pattern in your own life where the same kind of embarrassing or overwhelming reaction keeps recurring, particularly during moments of real stress, write below the single word for what that reaction usually involves. Naming your own inferior function honestly is often the first step toward the patient development that could eventually transform it from a source of chaos into a genuine, if modest, additional strength. Because the weakest and most neglected part of your own mind, according to Carl Jung's careful understanding, was never simply a flaw to be hidden and denied. It was, he believed, an unfinished piece of yourself, quietly waiting for exactly the patient attention that your more naturally gifted capacities received, without ever having to ask for it.